Good morning, everyone. Please find your seats. My name is Sadik. I am the Director of Research here at Nafis. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this seminar about the future of the United Nations system. We're very fortunate to have Professor Weiss here. As many of you probably know, he's had already a long and distinguished career, which I would say spans the pure academic work with the policy engagement that we value a lot here at UP and elsewhere. Professor Weiss has been formerly at Brown University. He came to the city, University of New York, I think in the late 1990s. Yeah. Author of, I don't know, author or co-author or editor of something like 40 or 50 books, I think. Former president of the International Studies Association, was part of the Commission on State Sovereignty and International Responsibility, editor of Global Governance, and now, zooming in on the topic of today's talk and seminar, the director of the UN Intellectual History Project, and now in charge of a project that looks at the future of the UN development system. We're very happy that you are here. We look forward to your so
Well, thanks, Roland. Obviously, one of my two reverend daughters would probably introduce me in another fashion, but we will skip over that. After a long time in this business, 4.5 decades, I guess, I remain an active, avid proponent of multilateralism, but I'm not a card-carrying member of the UN fan club, which creates a certain number of problems, not in this audience, but elsewhere. So the session, The Changing Development Landscape, is the UN system fit for purpose? If I were to answer this with an affirmative yes, my friends would think that unlike Bill Clinton, I have been inhaling as well as smoking. But could and should the UN system be made fit for the purpose? The answer to that obviously is yes. I want to start by just sort of putting out a few distinctions, definitions that I think are helpful. When my own UN textbook usually talks about 3 big activities: peace and security, human rights, humanitarian, and sustainable development. In looking at the way the UN parses operations, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, it's probably better to think about 4 pillars, although if I were a better PowerPoint artist, these would obviously have different sizes. On any given year, the last couple of years anyway, the peacekeeping part of operations are 8 to 10 billion. The justice and human rights would be about this big, probably about 500 billion, depending on what you're putting in it. The humanitarian one is somewhere between 10 and 12, and the development one, 12, 13, 15 billion, depending on what you're putting in it. Anyway, this is not a trivial something funny. When I talk about the UN, and I try to urge students as well to think about 3 UNs. The UN of member states, we're at the ministry this morning, and these are simplifications. The ministry is not a single circle, and the government's not a single circle, but for simplification purposes, there's the first UN of 193 governments, there's the second UN of 50,000 staff members, and there's a third UN of many people in this room, and elsewhere, NGOs, civil society, academics, commissioners, some members of the for-profit sector, and the media. And in my evaluation of some of the activities of the UN, it's really the space, the overlap of those red diagrams, and indeed where the most sort of intellectual sparks fly, not always operational sparks. In talking about the big products of the deliverables, if you will, of the UN system, I really think in a simplified binary way, there are ideas, norms, principles, standards, and there are operations, which, at least in the development arena, have mainly done technical assistance and capacity development. So, I'm going to spend a few minutes, as we mentioned, talking about the world of ideas, because I spent 10 or 11 years trying to document this in the Intellectual History Project. And the first thing I'm going to do is have the bad taste to quote ourselves. These are the last two sentences of the first of 17 books in the series, and people matter, and ideas matter. The people who work in these institutions, people who work on the institutions, in and around the institutions, and one of the main products, ideas. This after, as I said, 17 books in oral history, the propositions that we came up with as one of the comparative advantages of the UN system is the world of ideas. This is not highfalutin stuff, but it's really important to keep these 5 things in mind. The way we talk about issues is really critically important. The way that ideas help states and non-states define their interests and goals and how you set up agendas, particularly when they clash. Ideas help mobilize coalitions of states and non-states. Ideas actually eventually become embedded in institutions, and eventually ideas affect implementation. I'm going to do just a little short publicity for the 2 main books from this series, which the one on the left, UN Ideas, UN Voices, which summarizes and gives about 2% of the oral histories of 80 individuals who were involved from 1945 through the interviews we finished in about 2003. There's also a CD-ROM with all of the complete interviews with all of these individuals, and if anybody would like one of those, please let me know and I'll send it along. And the final book, UN Ideas That Change the World, tries to synthesize the other volumes in the series and talks about the big ideas that we think really, really matter. I'm just going to spend a few minutes just, I know the Secretary General, when he took a look at these books, and certainly his support, his speechwriter, talked about this whole product. Now, more than ever, the UN needs to fulfill its role as a powerhouse of ideas. I actually think that proposition is basically true. It's comparative advantage in the development as well as in other arenas. Here's what some people had to say who were in the interview pool. Stéphane Hessel, actually, who died recently, was the French ambassador in Geneva and New York. He was also around for drafting the Universal Declaration, and at the end of his life wrote something called Adebayo, which was about the importance of getting young people involved in multilateral affairs, specifically in the Middle East. But that first issue about the way we talk about ideas is critically important. And not only when people listen, sometimes when people don't listen. And in his view, read this yourself, one should not underestimate the importance of the way we talk about issues. So we're talking about human securities. This is obviously very different from bombs and bullets. We're talking about human development. This is very different from GDP per capita. So that first point, ideas are better in that way. The second way, this is Noeleen Heyzer, who now is the head of ESCAP. When I did the interview, she was in traded stories about the Jesuits, raised both of us. But Noeleen talks about that number 2, when the rubber hits the road. Most people think that international norms are kind of floating out there. In her view, international norms are picked up in the national societies. And she says, women ventured for the revisions of national norms and policies based on international standards. And there's actually some really interesting recent research done by a political scientist at Harvard, Beth Simmons, who tracks how NGOs and governments pick up human rights norms in particular and do something with them. So that second point, how you frame issues, how you redefine interests, and the fifth one, why they're important. The project, of course, talks about coalitions, and those of us who work on landmines or humanitarian issues or environmental issues talk about coalitions that didn't exist before 1972 in Stockholm, didn't exist before 75 in Mexico City and women, et cetera, et cetera. But coalitions can also hurt the issues, and there's a lot of evidence in our project about coalitions coming to way in new ways, but also lots of evidence of coalitions getting in the way. And here, Sadik talks about the protection force at the conference, where neither the Vatican nor Muslim states were terribly keen on her particular coalition. So ideas can help pull people together, but they can also help push them apart within the UN. And finally, the fourth point that we had was that ideas get embedded in institutions. There's also evidence that this is a plus, and here's evidence from Adedeji, who now, if anybody who's followed his career, was a minister. He was the head of ECA. He is now heading up an NGO, Nigeria, I think it was. But he talks about ideas outliving their utility. And much of the conversations we have, I think, about the UN development system, talk about institutions that are put together at one point in time and they never disappear. I think the only illustration of dismantling institutions actually was the 4 that were dismantled to put together UN Women. It's the first time in human history that we shelter an institution. Finally, this is why I had so much fun doing these interviews. This is Lourdes Arizpe, who was the deputy in UNESCO and an anthropologist of some note in Mexico. And she makes a case, I think, for why it's difficult to work in UN secretariats. It's just like when all the political parties are in power at the same time. But she uses this image, which I think I'm going to try to leave you with, that the United Nations has to be a magician of ideas and people who work there. I don't think it's impossible to improve the quality of what goes on in secretariats. I think lots of folks basically throw up their hands. And it's here where I keep thinking, and to go to a conversation under last night, I'd like to put these issues on the agenda for the next Secretary General. The development system as a whole, and the products in terms of ideas, norms, standards, and trying to get states to comply with those ought to be an important part of what the next Secretary General tries to do. I say this because You don't have to change international politics to change the Secretariat, the way you recruit, retain, vote, and exploit the people who work for you. And in the book, I can go into Q&A if you like. I just think there are numerous ways that you can get a whole lot more out of the system that exists by encouraging the kind of thinking that was at its best, I think, in the 50s and 60s, has diminished since, but there are lots of illustrations since as to when the UN system was on top of that. Okay. Operations. That 13 to 15 billion dollars in the development pillar only. And you'd have to say, you know, 30 to 70 institutions. What I'm going to be trying to argue throughout this is that we want to think about what is the comparative advantage, what is the comparative disadvantage of the U.S. system, and how you can push one and eschew the other. The project from which this material grows is, these students are too fast. Is based on a project that the Norwegian government has helped finance called the Future UN Development System Project. There are lots of things going on in this project, including some research. There's a book coming out of post 2015 UN development will be out in September that focuses on these issues. But what I'd like to talk about today is a combination of the surveys and meetings and some messages that came out of them on in terms of the role of emerging powers and the surveys as to what people think about the system. The S in UN development system, UNDS, what does that mean? Much of what I'm going to say will suggest that there's much less coherence and centralization than the word system implies. I usually use the term family because, like many of our families, this one is pretty dysfunctional. But what I'd like to focus on is there a way that the so-called system can be pulled together to be less atomized? You've got headquarters in 14 countries, 1,000 offices, 1,400 offices if you include all the peacekeeping and these building offices. So not only what does Tom think, but what do other people think? Over the course of the last 4 years, 2010, 12, and 14, with a colleague, Stephen Brown and I, we've done some surveys about the state or the way the system is perceived. Throughout these periods, and as I was saying, I'm going to try to tease out the 13 emerging middle income BRICS and others. But the pool of interviewees consists of about two-thirds of the participants from the south and about a third from the north. The views in the last one, it's not as balanced as I would have hoped. We were hoping to get, I'm sure, international, EU officials I'm not so interested in. I was hoping to get something like 20% from each pool. We're more like that, except the civil society is on the low side, and the for-profit sector is high. One has no idea who responds to this questionnaire. It's either based on about 3,500 answers. So we sent out about 22,000, so it's a decent return. Based on this sample and based on our own thoughts, I'm going to argue that there are 5 crises. I use the term crisis because I think that's the term that are facing the system at present. My colleagues Bruce Jones and Bruce Jenks argue that the UN system is punching below its weight. That's a modest way to say it. I think one should get much more from this. So what are these 5 crises that come out of our research and come out of this survey? The 5 C's. Hopefully this will help you remember. But competition. The UN system is ODA driven, and while ODA is going up, the UN's share of ODA is going down from 30 to 15% for the last 10-year period I can measure. In addition, of course, there are lots of other sources of funding. In particular, FDI is now 5 to 6 times the total ODA. Remittances are probably 2 to 3 times. There's lots of trade is booming. You've got sources like the Gates Foundation. So it seems to me that the UN needs to wake up and understand this new world. Now, there are ways of facing competition, partner with groups, etc. The first step in a crisis is to recognize that you have a crisis. More about that in a moment. Second, coherence, or incoherence, or lack of coherence. This is a prevalent lament. My colleague Richard Jolly, with whom I directed the Intellectual History Project, actually told me I should give up on this, that I should just deal with it. But I haven't given up the thought that one can pull this together more easily than we have in the past. And it seems to me that, I don't know what the case is in Norway, but I just gave a presentation in Stockholm where usually people are dressed in blue and they get UN photos and all of that. And I wasn't quite in Washington, D.C., but it wasn't the Stockholm I used to know. There were lots of critics. There was a couple of parliamentarians there, there were journalists, maybe only the hostile one showed up. Students, I mean, there was a great amount of skepticism. It just wasn't business as usual. These are the dogs that Bill Gates did participate in the survey. I stole that from a memo that he wrote when looking at the agricultural institutions. But the others are from people who participated in the survey, talking about the second crisis, incoherence. Number 3, we actually talked about this a lot this morning on cooptation. That is the extent to which the entire multilateral system is acting as an adjunct to donor bilateral assistance programs. Have we turned the UN system into kind of a subcontractor? My own view about UNDP is that it's now become really a sort of large consulting firm for funds that are coming from the outside. Over the last 15 years, 20 years, core resources, the untied resources, have gone from 80% of UNDP's budget to 20% of UNDP's budget. So for me, this is a third source of crisis. So while the ODA has continued to go up, in particular the growth of humanitarian parts of this, the part that agencies actually control, that they can run risk, which they can push their priorities, is remain the same, which means studies are going down. Capacity. In my view, it's time to start asking questions about what does the system do best, what does it do poorly, to emphasize one and not the other. Merely continuing to replicate the activities that have been going on for years is not a strategy for the future. One needs to make the case for the value added. I was actually, in terms of, this is the most recent survey, not the other two, I was actually quite interested. And these are, as I said, we were trying to tease out whether there are any substantial differences between industrialized countries, emerging powers, and other developing countries on a variety of questions. I actually think, Derek, when you asked me whether I was an optimist or a pessimist this morning, I was actually surprised at the extent to which the views about where there's a positive impact are actually more solidly positive than I would have thought. The ones that come out on top are the ones that I think in all the groups, basically, more in the West than elsewhere, humanitarian relief, peacekeeping, and crisis recovery. This is where people really think the system performs well. Over time and looking at this, and I haven't really had it. The survey only closed at the end of March, and these numbers were crunched by a Danish consulting firm, and I haven't had time to go through them, but I wanted to see what the change from 2 years ago to today was. And humanitarian relief remains at the top of the priority list. Peacekeeping is now moved up, and the other items have slid to lower levels, including the things I care about, research and analysis, but also technical assistance and negotiations. So this is in thinking about the capacity, this is at least what 3,500 people thought, and 3,500 the previous time. In trying to figure out, and there were four, you strongly agree or agree, disagree or strongly disagree. So we tried to group those in coming up with these percentages. What I find interesting is that at the top of the list, 80% of folks actually now think that it's the structures of these institutions themselves that are getting in the way of enhanced delivery, enhanced collaboration, enhancing. For me, that's the real takeaway line from this one, that the structures and earmarked funding, which are at the top, which was at the top the last time, remain in the use of factors and capacity. At least for me, in terms of needed changes, once again, the updating of the mandates and pushing together activities of the organizations, the greater use of technology, the common system platform, and a single gateway for research and publications. These things are really high in everyone's views. It doesn't matter which part of the world you're from. And so it seems to me that this is another message that donors like Norway should keep in mind. Once again, these are graphed by, I'm using blue graph, but this is the social part of the delivery system that probably include gender, but certainly health, education, and human rights come out, no matter what the category, as being a comparative advantage of the system. And if you're below 1, that basically means that there were more people who thought you were poor as opposed to decent at delivery. So the message really is up here on this end as to what the perceptions are that the system as well. Agencies don't like this one, unless you're on this end of the scale. What do people think about, and we try to do this ratio so that to pull out the differences in the so at the top, given the fact that it's health and education, etc., we have WHO, UNICEF, UNAIDS, and probably WFP. Surprisingly, UNDP. But anyway, it seems to me that it's clear what most people think is doing a job. It's also surprising to me, actually, how some institutions, particularly all of the regional bodies, come out at the bottom of the heap, along with ITC, Benito, UNTAD. So anyway, it seems to me that one should look at these two extremes to see what people think about the system as we move ahead. Can the system change? Yes or no? We try to push people to take a binary response. Obviously, high-income countries are more pessimistic than either emerging or developing countries. I'm still struck. I actually would have thought that the number might have been bigger in all of the categories. So it seems to me that this is, at least in terms of looking toward the future, this glass is more than half full, that people think it's possible. We don't have to just throw up our hands. It is possible to change this system. And so it seemed to me that that was a decent message as well. Should there be fewer moving parts, 30 or 70, depending on what you're putting in and keeping out, 30 penguins, I would say. What I found really surprising, you remember that pie chart about how many officials from where, but if you look at all of the people who were in secretariats or recently retired and had significant secretariat experience, the people who know this system best actually want or think that there should be fewer moving parts, the kind of you and women I mentioned earlier. And those outside, lots of people think there should be fewer, but fewer people in that category than in the agency staff. I thought that actually was surprising. Can we change the mandate and how business is done? Once again, people within the system answer yes to a far greater extent than people outside of the system. So this says to me that there is room within secretariats to change policies. I'm just going to do one more slide here, which is we're talking about partnerships. The people within secretariats, however, do not want, actually the topic it should be both for-profit and not-for-profit NGOs in the private sector. I need to change the slide. But people within UN agencies don't want them, whereas people who are outside, who are the prospective partners, actually would like to have more of a role within governing bodies. And if partnership is going to have any meaning, it seems to me that we'll have to do that. My fifth, the transition to the fifth crisis, they've all been labeled complacency. I feel, I said this last night, I sometimes feel in speaking with UN officials that it's a little like speaking to my brother about the state of politics in the United States. That there is a crisis. We cannot continue with business as usual. You can't ignore all of the statistical and other indicators that there's a problem. And I find that when I talk to UN staff members, there is really a kind of eyes glazing over. Now we can limp along, we can continue acting the way we are. And I keep saying, I think that we're not talking about monasteries. I think we're talking about, there's political science, or transformation. It really requires major, not change, not tinkering. Or 10 years from now, we will have an even more marginal, more anachronistic relic of the aftermath of the Second World War. As an illustration, a recent document from the Secretary General frames the argument as what changes are required in the UN development system so that we can remain a major actor. Well, frankly, I would rephrase his prose to say to halt the decline into irrelevance, because it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller, apart from the peacekeeping humanitarian part of the puzzle. So in terms of the UN development system, it seems to me that major change is necessary. And I frequently go back to the last time or the first of the major studies in 1969, the capacity study by Sir Robert Jackson, and he got himself into a major amount of trouble way back then by writing that the machine as a whole has become unmanageable in the strictest sense of the word. You can imagine what agency. As a result, it is becoming slower and more unwieldy, like some prehistoric monster. That was 1969. The dinosaurs are older. It seems to me that the world has changed, and we still have the same lumbering prehistoric monster. I think I've just listed some of the numerous attempts to say we have to move ahead, some of which have brought modest changes on the margins. The high-level panel on delivering as one has had an impact in some countries. For the system as a whole, it hasn't. So to go back to the title of this, the global context of development has changed dramatically in the last decade, but the UN system has not. I think it's possible to do something about this. Many of these rely upon donors, the people who finance the budget, as well as the UN Secretariat. The first one relates to funding, and I still, as I said this morning, have not lost faith that one could go back to more centralized funding, or at least centralized pools of funding to force agencies to do things together. I do think that rather than accretion every time we have a new issue or a new problem, to create yet another committee, another commission, another agency, that one could assign them to existing ones and pull existing ones together. As I said, I'd like a second example of UN Women sometime soon. The third, I do think this not going to be traditional technical assistance in most developing countries. I think it's going to be the effort to get North ideas and standards part of the public policy dialogue, so that we don't need the same kinds of offices that we have around the world, except in conflict-prone and fragile states where I believe the UN's comparative advantage operationally will be the next 10 to 15 years. I think that one needs, excuse me, ahead of the UN development system. This has been proposed over and over and over again. The Deputy Secretary General still is seen as somebody who places the Secretary General on every issue, not somebody who only looks at the development system. And I think it is a modest step that 70 years later we're still talking about it and hoping to sometime soon implement some experiments in system-wide performance and evaluation is actually a microcosm of the problems as a whole. So I'd like to see system-wide performance and evaluation. So with that, I'm going to stop. As I say, for those of you who are interested in these issues, the website, we bring out a monthly briefing on a particular issue. The current one is on the WHO and its challenges. The next one will be on the food institutions. The last one, this was the post-2005 development agenda, but Jose Antonio Campo. So there are lots of resources for people who are interested in these issues. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to stand up.
I will. Okay. Thank you so much. That was a very good overview of the issues facing the UN system. What I thought I'd do, I will try not to speak for too long, because I know there are many in the audience that have much more experience from the UN than I do. So I want to give a few remarks and then open up for a broad discussion. And I hope that you would all chime in and participate. I would like to start actually by revisiting a little bit the history of the UN, and I know that you're familiar with this, but I think it's important to keep in mind, because the assessment of the UN system today, not only the development system, but the UN in general, is often undertaken against the backdrop where one does not really recognize how the UN came into being and how it evolved over time. I mention this because when the UN was established and it was decided that the UN should have a permanent secretariat, that was not a foregone conclusion. The UN Secretariat was based on the model of the Secretariat that was established under the League of Nations. When they established the League of Nations, there was a big debate about whether to have a permanent international secretariat or whether to have different national representatives coordinating on a sectoral basis, which is more of a functional model, basically, that the UK representative would coordinate with the US representative on matters of finance. They would meet at regular intervals, and that would basically constitute the organizational structure of the League of Nations. So that was one view. The history behind why the secretariat model prevailed is a complex one, and I won't go into it here. But the result of that was that one decided at least two things. There should be a permanent secretariat with international civil servants. That was a new idea. It was decided that these international civil servants should have permanent contracts, and basically that they should be paid to be impartial, which meant that they should earn more than the highest paid national civil servant at the time that was in the UK. That model of a permanent international secretariat, whose staff was obligated to be loyal solely to an international cause, was super important for the formation of the UN and the system that we have today. Because the UN Secretariat was modeled precisely on the League model. They established the same rules for staff and how they were supposed to be paid. And many of the debates that we see today at the UNDP and elsewhere about staff and regulations stem from those decisions way back then about the terms of international civil servants' work. Why is this important? Because if you establish a new type of civil servants that are supposed to be loyal solely to something called the international, which at the time was not really strictly defined. What was the international space, basically, in 1945? Well, it was principally trying to prevent another war, of course, codification of international rules and norms. Over time, however, and this is also partly codified in the UN Charter, but if you look at the UN Charter and the powers or authority of the Secretary General and the Secretariat, it is not the type of almost expansive authority that they have today. Particularly under Dag Hammarskjöld, this was considerably expanded. And my argument is that the expansion of the Secretariat's authority, particularly under Hammarskjöld, was made by claiming to represent the international community. When Hammarskjöld claimed to represent and speak on behalf of the international community, often in defiance of the permanent members of the Security Council, that was of course a gamble, but he prevailed, both in the Peking formula, where he traveled to Peking to release US soldiers in captivity, on the Suez Crisis and in the Congo operation in 1960. He was acting more or less independently of what member states of the UN had decided. Today we know that the UN Secretariat manages UN peace operations, coordinates humanitarian relief, etc. Their claim to authority is based on representing and acting on behalf of something we call the international community. But they are now in a position to define what that international community is to a considerable degree. And often that the international community, the norms that they choose to advocate and advance, are often norms that are not those that some member states of the UN would like to see pushed forward. So the whole setup of the UN Secretariat, one could argue, is set up in a way that pushes forward certain norms and ideas and not others. I think you would be hard-pressed to find international civil servants that work for the UN today that are not ardent supporters of what we generally call liberal norms. There is a danger in that setup because the UN emerges as is claimed to be a global public actor that speaks on behalf of humankind, where some actors are much more influential in shaping the agenda of the UN. We know that there are 5 permanent members of the Security Council. The permanent 3, US, France, and the UK, they rotate and keep the main positions in the UN Secretariat. They are typically the so-called pen holders in drafting Security Council resolutions. This is not to say that China and Russia are not very important in the Security Council, of course. But my interpretation is that Russia and China are more taking the role of breaking and stopping certain developments that they do not like. They are not the ones that are pushing for certain developments in certain directions. I think this is important to keep in mind because, and there are 2 issues here. One is that as an organization set up to prevent or protect international peace and security, the arena function, the integrating function of the UN has been spectacularly successful. And when we evaluate the UN today, we often focus exclusively on the operational aspects and what they are doing in particular countries. So that's the positive side of the story, that it has fostered international integration and cooperation. That is quite remarkable. But that integration and cooperation has been pushed forward on certain terms that are more favorable to so-called Western states than some other states. And when there are big changes in the international system, this is something that can create tensions, and we see those going on at the UN and elsewhere today. But one of the big virtues of the UN system is that it has been able to accommodate such big tensions in the past, and I do think that it will be able to manage them in the future. But there is still the issue that I mentioned earlier, that the setup of the system is such that one should not be surprised to see representatives from the so-called Global South, the G77 norm, criticizing the Secretariat, for example, for being in the pocket of certain Western powerful states. One should not be surprised to see China and Russia trying to block certain developments. And we may disagree and think that this is very unfortunate, but for the multilateral system and for the UN as a legitimate and important arena, this is very important. Now, the very same setup that I mentioned with the international civil servants that are committed to things international, the definition of the international having a certain liberal, I think, bias, is important also, I think, to assess what you mentioned about the operational aspect of the UN. And there are 2 issues here. One is that and this does not only hold for the UN, but it also holds for other international organizations. These are, the UN in particular is often claimed to be a public actor. Now, what defines a public actor is that it has accountability vis-a-vis those that are affected by the decisions made as well. The second is that it has the capacity to enforce decisions. So, for example, the UN Security Council certainly has capacity, but it is not accountable. The UN General Assembly has accountability, but it doesn't have capacity. If you start to evaluate what the UN is doing operationally in different countries, this starts to get a little bit complicated, because the UN, and not to speak of many NGOs, are operating as de facto governors in many different countries, representing the international community, doing lots of good, but also doing stuff that the local population do not necessarily agree with. But the mechanisms for those that are affected by the doings and decisions of the UN, the mechanisms are not in place for them to complain and hold the UN as such accountable. This bears stressing, I think, because the UN is an international organization engaged in very specific governing operations in many different countries. And when that is performed by a state, we know about at least the ideal mechanisms by which to hold the government and political leaders accountable. For the UN, for the World Bank, for NGOs, that does not exist. It's basically a structural problem with all types of global or international governance. So the accountability aspect, in particular, I think, of how the UN operates in different countries and the mechanisms by which those that are affected by the decisions made by the UN is very important. And this goes directly to the issue of the relationship between the international and the local. Because those that represent the UN and the international community, so-called, to claim to speak on their behalf and to govern on its behalf, claim to know better than those that live in a particular country or community, and that it is by virtue of claiming to know better that they govern on others' behalf. Now, you know very well that there is a big debate about the tension or the problem of sort of local ownership at the UN and the World Bank and elsewhere. Basically, is about creating local buy-in and commitment from local actors. Now, the only reason that is a problem in and of itself, or from the start, is that the international has been defined as the position from where you decide to do things. And the local represents an inferior expression or manifestation of that. The standard that the UN is there to implement is a universal or international standard, and the status of the local knowledge and experience is inferior. And you see this reflected in the UN bureaucracy as well. I've done a very limited, admittedly, survey of those that work for UN peace operations. There are those that work in civil affairs, which are those that are in local communities to do stuff and get to know the local population and report back on local issues. And there are those that work in political affairs that are much closer to the head of mission in a particular country, or in the UN in New York or Geneva. About 80% of those that work in political affairs are from OECD countries. So there's a very significant degree of overrepresentation of rich country, OECD countries, in political affairs positions, which you don't find in civil affairs. Internally, in the organizational culture as well, those that work for civil affairs are considered lower on the internal hierarchy than those that work for political affairs. And there's very little rotation between those types of positions. And I think this is quite important in assessing what the UN is good at and what it can do. Which brings up a final issue, and I will, I think, conclude there, which is calls for streamlining, unification, increased effectiveness is, of course, understandable and to be desired. The flip side of it, or the what you could say is a problem, is that it makes sense to streamline and increase effectiveness if you think you know what is the best solution. If you have the solution, it makes sense to get all actors together and push forward in that particular direction. But it's not necessarily the case that the international community or the UN has the right solution. There are so many examples that we could probably all think of where the solutions proposed by the international community or the UN doesn't really fit with the local context. and where there are different approaches to a particular problem, advanced by different actors, and there are certain virtues in having different organizations pushing different solutions. And one of the positive signs that I think you address in your book on the business of humanitarian relief is that the competition between different both NGOs and international organizations are generating at least some trend towards cooperation between different types of both UN organizations and others that are based on effectiveness and cooperation at the country level and local level, rather than being directed as a coordination effort by the senior management in New York or by donors. So UNOPS can deliver services basically for the World Food Program or vice versa, or UNDP. Similarly, with the cooperation now between the World Bank and the UN, where the World Bank say that the infrastructure for service delivery that the different UN organizations have is vastly better than what the World Bank can ever achieve. And so using the infrastructure that the UN organizations have in different sectors and cooperating with them may be a way forward. So there are some positive signs that basically what one could call a market for international organizations is emerging slowly, that will perhaps resolve the coordination duplication issue not by top-down decree, but by more market-based solutions that they cooperate at the country or local level. I'll stop there and now take on my hat as chair. And do you want to respond to any of the stuff that I said, or should we just open for Q&A?
Well, if I respond to each of these points, it'll take up most of the time. But let me at least take a crack at a couple of them. Actually, I'm intrigued to hear that there's somebody else on the planet who's interested in looking at the composition of international secretaries. Because I've been actually urging students of anthropology and sociology for years to begin looking at the way MSF is composed, who works for them, etc., what happens, the differences with WHO, and almost nobody has access to this information, and personnel problems get in the way. I actually, to just go back to where you started, my dissertation happened to be in the great experiment in international administration, which was the big invention, and the move away from political representatives within secretaries to something larger. As you point out, Hessel, of course, was the champion of this. I've always been concerned at the extent to which we moved away from that particular ideal, driven at first by the United States and the Soviet Union wanting to have their lackeys, having clearances in order to work in the Secretariat, and thereby setting the stage that virtually all senior appointments were government people, and sort of institutionalizing not some larger conception of global interest or global public goods or anything else, but rather the replication of 50 and 193 voices within the Secretariats. So I've actually been concerned at the deterioration of the international civil service rather than its institution. In terms of the subject that one of the subjects we're talking about today, I'm also involved in a project on World War II history and the origins of the UN. And what I'm really intrigued about is that even before the Atlantic Charter, but certainly starting on the 1st of January 1942 with the Declaration on United Nations, 44 countries got together, and there were two things. One was a commitment to defeating fascism, but there was also a commitment to multilateral cooperation. Obviously, there are bigger players and smaller players, but the importance of the two things, fighting a war, also a commitment to fighting it in a particular way and picking up the pieces during the war, and the conferences that were held during the war on every topic that, food and agriculture, and air transport and finance and trade, etc. And the first operational effort, which was on the Rehabilitation Organization. So that this mixture of national interests, but national interests defined to include something slightly larger that in fact our national interests are best served through multilateral as opposed to purely unilateral or bilateral means. So the puzzle for me is why we can actually think under duress during the war about big ideas and big changes, and then as soon as the war is over, it's status quo ante, and slide back into the old ways of operating. So obviously, do we need a war to make us think differently? I keep hoping the answer to that is no, but I'm not sure. Some parts of the UN actually, I would argue, benefit in the pockets of the West, but in the pockets of the global South. There seems to me there's enough of being in everybody's pocket to go around here. For years I worked for OTAD, and it was supposed to be the ambassadors representing the South. So I think it's pretty hard to say that the Secretariat represents any Secretariat represents a particular point of view. I think that the person who heads the Secretariat actually has a lot to do with the way it operates. That's why I still think that leadership of the next Secretary General, the next head of UNHCR or UNICEF or whatever it is, are critically important. Critically important appointments. I guess I have less faith in market-based solutions in the humanitarian or the development arena. What I probably jump over too quickly is I think that the division of labor in the future will be the UN system as a whole, with its universal membership, its convening powers, focusing in all countries on big goals, objectives, norms, and their implementation and reporting on those. That implementation or lack of implementation. But in an operational way, focusing on the mechanisms in conflict mode, post-conflict, and very poor fragile states, and trying to pull together what only the UN can actually pull together, which is everything from the political decisions to the use of military force, enforcement and peacekeeping, humanitarian human rights, and then whatever we're going to call the transition back to development, peace building. So I think that that's where the operational activities of the future will be located, although the countries in the middle are not so keen on hearing that, but I think that's actually
Great, thank you. Comments, questions?
Yes, thank you very much to the panel. It's very penetrating and interesting observations. Two general comments and questions. First, it's easy to agree that the UN is in need of restructuring and reforms. I saw all of them participating in the election debate in the UN, for example, and followed various restructuring processes, and perhaps not too much have come out of it. But still, isn't the overriding problem which also plagued the League of Nations and has plagued the UN rather the need to reconcile national interest and national identity with the need for international knowledge. And that's the biggest question. Is there any way to get around this question, or is this something which we have lived with probably for many, many years? Second comment on what you said on the power of ideas. Yes, of course, the power of ideas is great. If you look at the UN today, could you say, with the exception of ideas which emanate from the General Assembly and from other statesmen, where in the UN today are ideas produced? What is the role of the Secretary General in producing ideas? And then the difficulty in advocating ideas with the world as it is today. Isn't it, and the contradictions in the General Assembly? Isn't it very difficult to envisage that today it will be possible to rally around some good old-fashioned ideas with radical and far-reaching implications? So my suggestion would be, if you talk about ideas in a more limited sense related to the solving of concrete problems, crisis management, then I think that ideas are very good. I also accept that certain ideas, like the Security Council Resolution 242, where you set down certain general laws, is a good thing. And then the third question goes like this. You mentioned certain areas of relations where UN really have done a very good job, but you didn't specify too much. But if you look at the history of UN today, can you point to a certain area where the UN definitely has certain clear advantages which no other institution, no other country in the world has? I'm thinking a little bit of the complex humanitarian relief operations, where UN before definitely still has certain advantages. Do you see a future for, let's say, reorientation or renaissance of UN leading complex humanitarian relief operations, or do you see clear limits to that concept today? Thank you.
Should we collect a few questions?
Without it? Sure. That way I can avoid them.
Thank you. I had the privilege of working a dozen years both as, sir?
Microphone.
No, I don't need I speak loud enough. You need. Oh, sorry. Okay. Is it working? Yes, ma'am. Okay. I had the privilege of working a dozen years as an international and national civil servant for the UN, both in New York and on the other side of the Atlantic. In Rome, actually. It's a long way from New York to the field, but they actually call Rome the field in New York sometimes. That's fine. And there's a lot of things to agree and disagree with both of you. I just have to agree that leadership is extremely important. Who leads the organizations really makes a huge difference. Management is very important. In a way of looking at it from the role side, WFP, to be precise, it wasn't really the lack of ideas that was striking. It was more the lack of operational capacity in other agencies, delivery capacity, and people who were actually doing things. That's how it was seen in Rome. There was a lot of ideas, but the lack of people to carry it through. And maybe even I would ask whether the UN isn't more about harmonizing various ideas and being a platform and venue for coherence and political harmonization of ideas rather than creation of them. And I also do agree the humanitarian side is very well coordinated and well regarded, and I think the development system can learn a lot from the coordination on the humanitarian side, which has come far. One thing I would disagree on, and I think the professor also disagreed a bit on your premise of a liberal bias in the international bureaucracy. You can, as my former ambassador Jakin said, you can also find the opposite argument in many countries, that there is a let's say, anti-liberal bias in the UN system. I think you are making a mistake if you say that, for example, the Security Council is less accountable than the General Assembly, that there is a liberal bias, that there's a pro-Western bias, in the sense that you are presuming that the governments are the entities that the Secretariat is let's say, serving on behalf of. But the charter says we are serving on we the peoples. And what I really has found in the UN system, inside the system, is a strong commitment to help the most vulnerable and marginalized people. Not necessarily the government, and accountability flows down. If you don't have an accountable government, you are not necessarily more accountable in the General Assembly. If you don't have democratic accountability to your own people. But I think the UN system really has that, and the Secretary General was very clear about this, both the previous one and this one, in his 5-year plan, that the focus on the vulnerable people is extremely important. And so I disagree that there is a liberal bias. I think it's a human rights and humanitarian perspective and focus, whether that's a bias or, but it's certainly a good thing.
Sure. Well,
Go ahead, and I'll jump in.
If I had, if this were only on ideas, one of the slides I would have stuck in was what we mean by ideas, and you know, there are big ideas like equality and self-determination, and then there are instrumental ideas. How do you move those here and there? What percentage of resources ought to be devoted to ODA events? So there are these big ideas and little ideas. I'm focusing on the big ideas, whether it's gender, human rights, the environment. But within this context, the UN is not often, it sometimes is, but not often, a creator. Margaret Johannesson gave me an alliterative framework that the UN has a value added in one or two or sometimes all ways. And she called it the F, a different F word. So she said there's several roles, and I think this is true, that sometimes it's a place where an idea starts. It's for fun. Sometimes it's a place where you baptize an idea, sometimes it's for fun. Sometimes it's really about funding. Sometimes it's about blowing a horn and fanfare. Sometimes it's just a place to discuss an idea and see whether there can be picked up to a forum. And the one we don't have frequently enough is a funeral. But the UN's value added in the ideas business is in 1, 2, 3, 4, all of those ways, and so we should distinguish them. The age-old problem with national interests and community interests. I mean, I'm not aiming very high here always. I think it is possible to define or redefine state interests to include larger considerations. That's why I'm so fascinated now by the World War II experience. But in a different way, something I've done a lot of work on, the responsibility to protect. How do you halt mass atrocities? So I'm not aiming very high here. I mean, you know, we're not talking about the garden variety of abuse in lots of states. We're talking about mass atrocities. And it seems to me that what we're moving toward is to say that it's in Norway's interest, it's in Rwanda's interest, it's in everybody's interest to have a planet on which genocide, various kinds of mass murder, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing are not policy options. And it seems to me that that's the kind of redefinition of interest. And it's a bigger jump for climate change and other things. But it seems to me that there are ways in which ideas can be used to reframe, say, what really is in my national interest? That's the exercise I'm involved in. The Secretary General occasionally is associated with an idea. At present, the current one's not associated with very many. What I'm looking for is not, it is pockets of excellence, the kind of thing that the Human Development Report beginning in 1990, this sort of small protected group that can cry from the rooftops. But over the period of the last 20 years, has actually changed the way everybody talks about the nature of measuring what's important in the development enterprise. I think something like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has totally changed. Even in Washington, the way that the science of climate change is perceived. So I think there are lots of ways in which one can come together in an international context to push these ideas.
Very briefly before I leave the work with you on this, my point about the commitment of those that work in the UN sector was a narrow one, in that in the UN Charter it doesn't say that the Secretary General speaks on behalf of the whole world. That is a role that has evolved over time. That's the first point. The second point is that initially in the establishment of the UN Charter, the liberalism in that charter was that the liberal aspect in terms of tolerance and autonomy was organized around territorial states, Article 2.7. Over time, there has been an evolution from that charter liberalism to something that is closer to anti-pluralist liberalism, which involves norms about what you can and cannot do. As the work that you did on R2P, protection of civilians, human rights, that whole agenda is, in my reading, a liberal agenda, and I think one would be hard-pressed to find many that work in the UN Secretariat that are against more international governing, more global governance. That is the argument I'm making. Okay. Yeah, please.
Thank you, Berit Blomberg from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And thank you very much for both presentations. I have some comments to both of you. First to Professor Weiss. Professor Weiss. Tom, that's easier. And I will focus on what you said about coherence and collaboration. And especially the slides you had, I think, almost called so many initiatives, so little has happened, or something like that, and then one slide on the quick fixes. Because I must say that I'm a bit puzzled about what were in those lists and what were not. And especially with regard to more recent developments. For example, the high-level panel was mentioned on the list of so little has happened. But my question in that regard is whether you take into consideration recent developments which has partly defined the delivering as one modality as the main way of the UN to do business at country level. And the latest update is that there are 39 countries that have adopted the delivering as one model now. Other issue or other developments, I would say, which were not on your list, is the establishment of the Chief Executive Board. I think headed by the Secretary General, and I think established in 1999, as far as I remember. And the subsequent inclusion by Kofi Annan of the UNDG as one former pillar of the Chief Executive Board. And this Chief Executive Board and the three pillars are negotiating, as far as I know, a lot of common guidelines which they issue to all the members in all the organizations. So it would be interesting to hear your view on that. And a question for clarification when it comes to one of these quick fixes you mentioned as I think you call it the development coordinator. So my question for clarification then is whether this is something which is suggested for the global level and which is different from the role of the Chief Executive Board. Since at the country level you have the resident coordinator, which I would assume carries out that function which was expected. And then one comment on what Ole Jakob said about accountability. Accountability at country level, or the accountability of the UN to the host country. I think it would be interesting to hear a bit more about what you mean by when you're saying that there is no accountability at that level. Taking into consideration both that the UN is present in a country at the invitation of a host government, and that the program of which is now a joint program in most countries of the UN is negotiated on with the government and supposed to be based on their development policies. Thank you.
Any other comments?
Thanks to both of you. Social touch on so many things, and I cannot comment on them all. But one of the, I think, most thorny issues in discussing the future of the UN development system is the priorities. There are very strong arguments, and I think we will be on that side that priorities should be given to the post-conflict, to the fragile state, to the countries most in need for assistance. Unfortunately, if you look at the trends of financing, the trends are not going in this direction. And there is a strong current among the middle-income countries that they want to at least keep their part of the package, their share of the total ODA funding, and indeed this share is now going up. And I think the discussions with the middle-income countries is already going on in the boards and in other fora of the UN. Tom, you were quite recently in Rio and for a seminar with the Brazilians. So I wonder if you could sort of say some words on how you see the mood within the income countries, the emerging economies, on the issue of priority setting, their role in relation to the poorer countries, and also whether there are signs that they are beginning to take on a larger roles and responsibilities for both the global development agenda, but also on the larger global public goods agenda.
Oh, okay. The answer is that there's little evidence that they're willing to take on a larger agenda. Karen was referring to a meeting that held a research meeting on the role of emerging powers and the development system, which is why, at least in this purpose, I teased out where the differences among developing emerging powers and developed countries. And when I actually, before Rio, I was in Santiago, I gave a talk at Stéphane on priorities, and I focused on Stéphane Reclec's level rating, higher than the other regional got into a conversation about Chile as a middle-income country, which just had a huge fire in Valparaiso, and which the government was saying, UN, please help. And for me, the difference is whether the country has the capacity to do this stuff itself. And there's no doubt that Chile has the capacity to do it itself. And in a world of limited resources, it seems to me that you just say this is not what we can do. We don't call it triage, but anyway, it's something that makes the decision about priorities, which is an undemocratic way to say triage. But in the conversation in Rio, most of the time was spent, as I said, Silke was trying to put on the view from the DAC and OECD countries toward assuming more responsibilities, and there was obviously pushback on that, and so we're certainly not there yet. And then much of the conversation then shifted to how do emerging powers deal with other developing countries in a relationship that involves aid, but not from the recipient, involved investment, which to me looks pretty much the way investment usually looks, which social investment is not high on the list. Investors, extraction of minerals, etc. And so there was not any great meeting of the minds here, I'd have to say, even though it seems to be, and I thought I had answered the question earlier, and I should have come back to it, that whether it's complex emergencies, whether it's complex world states, whether it's picking up the pieces after certain kinds of disasters that seem to be located in really poor countries, that this is where there isn't a competitor for the UN that has this panoply of skills, and has expertise, and has the ability to pull in outsiders when it works. And on occasion, it has worked. And it's that where I personally think we ought to head. But as you say, this is it's more than my view and your view, but it's certainly not widespread as yet. And in fact, I guess the conversation about I really find it fascinating. Turkey, Korea, Mexico, they're in the OECD, but they're not in DAC. Are they going to go along, or will they take guidelines from OECD DAC, or will we go our own way? And will other BRICS is an intriguing set of issues, and so one of the papers, which calls about the battleground between OECD and whatever is going to emerge among emerging powers, that it seems to me that there's very little willingness to say that our share of the pie should be less, and I find it hard to understand, but that seems to be the reality. No, we're back to how full or how empty is the glass. The way I count for the 2006 panel, there are 10 recommendations that we kind of delivering as one of those. And on the 10, we counted a full score. There are 2.5 of the 10 thoughts that have actually been implemented. Lots of the big ones, like getting rid of the regional commissions and what have you, have gone nowhere. And I simply, the list that was up there is not every change that's occurred. It's the big, high-level, visible commissions, panels, etc., that have supposedly gotten wide attention on this issue. Those are the ones. And for me, as I say, in some ways, I think we could do a whole lot worse than going back and rereading Jackson, which was the last really comprehensive book, I think, and the last time we had that conversation. So the half empty, half full. In some ways, the founding fathers, there weren't very many mothers, but anyway, the founders of the UN would have trouble recognizing the system. And there were a lot of things that changed. You know, the environment, we've now got an institution on the environment and ministries of the environment, et cetera, et cetera. So it's, in lots of ways, the system has adapted, but the adaptation has taken the form of accretion, more and more moving parts, not trying to pull together in any systematic way what's going on. And so for me, the one example that I've come up with, the UN Women, would have been even better had the UNFPA also stuck on with UN Women, which is the main operational tool. So we still got, even in that arena, a couple of moving parts. And so, I don't know, I guess I'm going to say the glass is 25% full.
Just very briefly on the accountability. When the UNDP or some UN agency is doing something in a country, it has an agreement with the host government, of course. But those that are affected by the decisions and operations of some UN agency cannot hold the UN as such or that actor to account. There are rulings in the European Court of Human Rights, for example, where the court threw out the case because it doesn't have jurisdiction over the UN. In this case, there's a structural issue there, and I've written about this with my colleague Sadik in the back about the configuration of publicness at the global level. I'm not saying that this is always a problem, but it may come up and it can come up in many instances because those that are affected by the decisions and operations of UN and other agencies and actors do not have mechanisms by which to hold those actors to account. So there is a formal legal aspect to it, but there is also an aspect that has to do with substantive feedback and decision-making basis. We have to conclude because it's from 30. I just want to say that I agree with you that the focus on IDs is important. But the crucial question, I think, is which IDs prevail. IDs are important. And if you look at which IDs prevail, it's typically those that are advanced by actors that have positions that are already quite powerful. So there is a reason why the new international economic order is no longer with us. There's a reason why I think there is no coincidence that there is we have the Millennium Development Goals. They are about poverty and other issues. They're not about redistribution of wealth. And that is no coincidence. It reflects the power relationships that exist in the world, and that some actors are in a better position to define the ideas that the UN will subsequently have to come and try to implement, which I think is important very much. You want to? It should be your final word before we conclude, since you're our guest all.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I still recall the initial debate surrounding the Human Development Report in Washington, saying, well, how could it possibly be that we're not number one in all these categories? And Chad saying, what right do you have to say that we're the worst country? So there's room, I think, for, I don't know what they call it, counter hegemonic ideas. I mean, there's more room than one company thinks. And on other issues like landmines, in which the big powers and the major powers were against it, they still have gone through the International Criminal Court. So I think that there's actually more room for a wealth of ideas to be interjected in the conversation than we think.
On that positive note, thank you so much. Thank you.